Margaret Aldridge only realized the bundle curled against the iron gate was a human being when the old wool scarf shifted beneath the thin layer of snow. Until that moment, she had been certain someone had left behind a sack of clothing at the entrance to the Hollow Pines estate. But then she saw a thin hand reaching out from the edge of the fabric, the knuckles cracked from the cold and marked with a few fresh scratches. The woman had drawn herself tight against one of the gate's stone pillars, hugging her own knees, as if trying to fold her entire body into that frayed, worn scarf. Dawn still blanketed the high country of Aspen, Colorado, with a damp cold that slipped through every seam of clothing, making the rows of pines vanish behind a curtain of pale white snow. Not a single car passed along the mountain road. No fresh tire tracks were pressed into the snow, and no grown soul was out searching for the young woman. There was only the woman, the iron gate, and the scarf that Margaret could not look at for long without a strange ache tightening in her chest. She lifted the storm lantern and stepped closer. But before she could touch her, the young woman's eyes flew open, and she yanked the fabric hard against her body. She did not cry out. She did not beg. She only let her eyes dart around, searching for a way to flee, in the manner of those who learned too early that not every outstretched hand is offered as shelter. Margaret stopped a few paces away. She was 74 years old, and understood the weight of an absence. But there was something in those eyes that awakened a sorrow older even than her own years. "I won't hurt you," she said, very softly. The young woman did not answer. Her lips were blue, her thin coat soaked through with the night's dew, her brown hair plastered to her forehead. When Margaret asked her name, she stayed silent so long that the old woman thought no answer would come. "Clara," she said at last, in a voice far lower and warier than her 27 years should have allowed. What neither woman yet understood was that this iron gate was not a place where Clara had stopped by chance. For 50 years, a secret had been waiting to lead her mother's daughter back here, and the old scarf she clutched in her hands was about to bring down a secret that Margaret had buried for longer than this young woman had been alive. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, so we can walk together through the healing stories still waiting ahead. Margaret did not hurry forward anymore. She only stepped back half a pace, set the storm lantern down on the snow-covered ground, and let the distance between them speak the reassurance that words could not. It took a long while, so long that both their breaths had turned into thin streams of smoke, dissolving into the bitter air, before Clara finally agreed to stand. She rose in the manner of someone who had grown used to managing on her own, one hand still pressing the cloth tightly against her chest, the other braced against the stone pillar to keep her balance because her numb legs were almost beyond feeling. Margaret walked ahead, slowly, not once looking back to urge her on, as though she understood that even turning her head too quickly might be enough to send the girl vanishing into that murky white curtain of snow. The gravel path leading up to the mansion seemed longer than usual that morning, and Clara followed behind, leaving shallow, uneven footprints in the snow, the marks of someone so exhausted she no longer seemed to have enough weight left to sink deeply into the earth. When the heavy oak door of the main foyer opened, warmth from inside rushed out like an invisible hand. But Clara stopped at the threshold. She did not step through. She stood there, half inside and half outside, her eyes sweeping over the wide room to memorize every exit before allowing herself to believe in anything at all. Esther, the housekeeper who had been tied to Hollow Pines for nearly 40 years, immediately knelt beside the great fireplace, stirred the embers that were still glowing red, and added several dry pine logs. The fire flared up, throwing gold-orange streaks of light dancing across the high ceiling and over the pale face of the strange visitor. Walter Hayes, the estate manager, stood leaning against the doorframe that led into the hallway, his arms folded across his chest, his gaze resting on Clara with a wariness he did not bother to hide. In all the years he had looked after Mrs. Aldridge's property, he had seen too many people come to these gates with sorrowful stories and hidden hands quietly reaching out for something. He did not believe in coincidence, and he believed even less in a young woman appearing out of nowhere in the very season when those eyeing the Aldridge inheritance had begun circling again. Margaret gestured toward the armchair near the fireplace and invited Clara to sit, but Clara shook her head. She remained standing, her back stubbornly straight, even though her entire body was trembling from the cold. Margaret asked how far she had walked through the night, and only after a very long silence did Clara answer that she did not clearly remember, only that she had come from the town at the foot of the mountain, where she had once worked the night shift as a waitress in a small roadside diner, until the place closed, and the owner disappeared before paying her the last wages she was owed. Her mother had died only a few weeks earlier, and the rented room the two of them had shared had been taken back as soon as Clara could no longer pay for it. She told all of this in a voice so strangely flat that there was not a single tear, not one word of complaint, as though she were recounting the life of some distant stranger instead of her own. Margaret listened in silence, and she realized that it was precisely that calmness that hurt her heart most of all. A person who still had the strength to cry was a person who still expected someone to come and offer comfort. But the girl standing before her had learned how to carry her losses quietly, so she would not become a burden to anyone. When Margaret asked why she had come all the way to such a remote place, Clara looked toward the fire and said that before closing her eyes for the last time, her mother had told her again and again about a house on the highland, where the snow slept along the fences and the pines rose tall as though trying to touch the sky. Her mother had told her to find that place and give this cloth to the person who would recognize it. Clara did not know who that person was, and she did not know what the cloth meant. She only knew it was her mother's final wish, and she had walked for days to fulfill it. Margaret was about to say something, but Clara spoke first, and this time her voice was much firmer. She said she had not come here to beg. She did not need anyone's pity, and if she was allowed to stay through the storm, she would work to repay it. Any work at all. Cleaning, tending the fire, scrubbing, as long as no one had to give her anything as charity. Mrs. Aldridge could keep her compassion for someone else. Clara only needed a roof over her head and a chance not to owe anyone. Those words made the entire room fall silent. Walter's brow tightened slightly, not out of irritation but out of surprise, because people pretending to be miserable rarely refused what was offered freely, and Margaret, standing there beneath the flickering firelight, suddenly felt her chest tighten once more, because that hard, unyielding pride, that way of lifting one's head in the middle of utter desperation, was something she had seen in someone else, a very long time ago. In this very house. It took Margaret a while to persuade Clara to move away from the threshold, and even after she had sat down in the chair near the fireplace, she still held herself like someone ready to rise at any moment, her back not fully resting against the chair, her legs drawn together and angled toward the door. Esther brought a wooden tray from the kitchen. On it sat a steaming cup of hot tea and a thick slice of bread spread with glossy yellow butter and a little homemade blueberry jam. She set the tray down on the small table in front of Clara with a kindly smile, then stepped back to stand beside Margaret, the two older women quietly watching. Clara looked at the slice of bread, and though hunger was clawing at her stomach so fiercely that her hand trembled slightly, she still did not touch it. She sat motionless, her eyes lifting to search Margaret's face as though waiting for something. A permission, a sign that she truly had the right to eat and was not taking someone else's portion. Margaret understood that moment of hesitation at once, and in her gentlest voice, she told Clara that the food was hers, and that she should feel free to eat. Only then did Clara reach for the slice of bread, and Margaret noticed that she did not hold it in one hand the way people usually did, but lifted it with both hands, cradling it carefully as if afraid someone might snatch it away from her, then took one tiny bite at a time, slowly, chewing with care, stretching out each moment as though making certain not a single crumb would be wasted. Margaret had seen many hungry people in her life, but the way Clara ate was not the way of someone who was merely hungry. It was the way of someone who had often not known where her next meal would come from. She turned her face away for a moment, pretending to adjust the blanket draped over the arm of the chair so Clara would not see that her eyes had begun to sting. When the girl had eaten almost all of the bread, she reached for the cup of tea, and it was then that something happened that made Margaret's heart seem to stop. Clara did not lift the cup right away. She placed her thin fingers around its rim, then turned it very gently on the tabletop. Once, twice, 3 small circles clockwise, a slow and unconscious gesture, like a habit that had sunk deep into blood and bone since childhood, before finally lifting the cup and bringing it to her lips. Margaret stood frozen. The whole room seemed to recede from her all at once, the crackle of wood in the fireplace turning blurred and distant, as if echoing back from somewhere far away, and in that moment she no longer saw the strange young woman sitting before her. She saw a brown-haired little girl seated on a high chair in the old kitchen, turning her cup of warm milk exactly 3 times before every drink, turning it while giggling over a tiny game that only mother and daughter understood. Rosalind. That name struck through Margaret's chest with a weight she had believed she had buried after all those years. For more than 50 years, she had not seen anyone make that gesture. For more than 50 years, not since the morning they carried her daughter out of her life forever. And now it had appeared right before her eyes, alive and intact, in the hands of someone she had never met. She had to grip the arm of the chair to keep herself from swaying. Esther glanced at her with concern and softly asked whether she was all right. But Margaret only shook her head, forced a pale smile, and said she was merely a little dizzy from the cold of the morning. She tried to make reason speak louder inside her, telling herself that there were thousands of people in the world, and surely many of them had strange little habits alike when holding a cup of tea, that such a small gesture could not possibly be proof of the thing her aching heart secretly longed for. But no matter how many times she told herself so, the memory that had just risen inside her would not lie still again, and when Clara set the teacup down and lifted her eyes slightly, meeting Margaret's gaze, Margaret quickly turned away, her heart tangled between a hope so fragile it hurt, and an old fear that if she allowed herself to believe in it, she would once again have to bear a loss. She was not sure her aging heart still had the strength to endure. That afternoon, after the snow had stopped falling and the sky had turned a heavy leaden gray, a polished black car rolled slowly up the sloping road that led into Hollow Pines, leaving behind 2 deep tire tracks cut straight through the white snow. Walter was the first to hear the engine, and the way he reacted said a great deal, because the usually composed estate manager immediately straightened, smoothed the front of his coat, and hurried toward the door with an urgency no one had seen in him all day. The man who stepped down from the car was not grandly tall, nor was he wearing anything flashy, only a dark wool coat tailored precisely to every seam, and the unhurried gait of a man who had never once had to rush for anyone in his life. Theodore Cole, the man the entire region knew by the name Thatcher, stopped in the middle of the snowy courtyard, his eyes sweeping once around the mansion like a man taking inventory of his own property, and the mere way he stood there, silent and needing no words, was enough to make the air around him seem to sink. Walter bowed his head to greet him with a respect edged by caution, saying that Mrs. Aldridge was still well and that everything in the house was in order, but the manager's eyes accidentally flicked toward the window, where Clara's figure could be seen faintly inside, and Thatcher, who never missed a detail, caught that glance. He did not ask right away. He took out his phone, pressed it to his ear, and spoke into it in a few brief sentences, his voice so calm it was chilling, instructing the person on the other end to finish handling some matter before nightfall, and not to make him repeat himself a second time, then hung up without a word of goodbye. The whole exchange lasted less than a minute, with no shouting and no threat spoken aloud, yet Walter still gave a slight shudder beside him, because he understood that real power never had to raise its voice to make people obey. When Thatcher stepped into the foyer, Margaret rose to greet him, with a rare, warm smile blooming across her tired face, and in that moment, the powerful man who made an entire region wary of him softened as though he had become someone else entirely. He took her hand, asked whether she was warm enough and whether she had taken her medicine on time, his voice losing the icy edge it had carried moments before, and replacing it with the awkward tenderness of a man unused to showing affection. Margaret was the only person in this world who had ever reached out to him when he had nothing left, and he had never forgotten that. But then his eyes landed on Clara, and every trace of softness on his face closed at once like a steel door. He looked at the strange girl sitting close beside the fireplace, studying her from her torn shoes to the old cloth she still clutched against her chest. And a warning bell began ringing in his mind. He had lived too long in a world where nothing was accidental, where everyone who appeared carried some hidden purpose, and the sudden arrival of an unknown young woman at this exact gate, at the exact time when vultures were circling around Mrs. Aldridge's fortune, was a coincidence he could never bring himself to believe. He asked Margaret, in a voice gentle but full of meaning, who this guest was, how long she had been here, and who had allowed her to pass through the gate. Margaret briefly told him the story of the cloth and the final wish of Clara's late mother, but Thatcher listened with a face that revealed nothing, and when she finished, he turned to look directly at Clara, with eyes sharp enough to pierce through every layer of disguise. He did not accuse her of anything, nor did he say a single harsh word, but that searching silence was heavier than any question, and Clara, though exhausted to the edge of collapse, still lifted her head and met his gaze without looking away, because she had grown far too used to being looked at by the world through suspicious eyes, and she had nothing left to lose that could make her fear one more stare. The heavy silence between Thatcher and Clara stretched on a little longer, until Esther stepped in and gently suggested that the girl should move closer to the fireplace to warm herself before she caught cold, and Clara, after a moment of hesitation, rose and edged toward the flames. It was in the very instant she stood up, when her exhausted body was no longer alert enough to guard every movement as before, that the woolen scarf she had been clutching tightly since morning suddenly slipped from her shoulder and fell, spreading one corner across the rug before the fireplace. The firelight washed over the fabric, and for the first time since Clara had entered this house, the entire pattern woven into the scarf appeared clearly beneath that warm, golden glow. It was a row of snowflakes woven in blue wool that had faded with the years, each one following the next along the edge of the scarf, every flake shaped with 6 perfectly balanced points like the real snowflakes outside. Margaret let her eyes pass over them absently, but then her gaze stopped at one place, and her whole body seemed to turn to stone. Among dozens of evenly made 6-pointed snowflakes, there was one, and only one, that had just 5 points. A tiny flaw, almost impossible for anyone else to notice. One missing point hidden among the perfection of all the others. But to Margaret it flashed before her like lightning tearing through the night. She did not need to look a second time to know, because her own hands had made that mistake on a freezing winter night more than 50 years ago, beneath the wavering light of an old oil lamp. She moved toward the scarf as if drawn by an invisible force, her legs trembling, her breath coming fast, and her wrinkled hand slowly reached out, shaking, about to touch the corner of the fabric where the snowflake was missing its point. But Clara was quicker. The moment she realized that the older woman's eyes were fixed on the scarf and that her hand was reaching for it, she immediately bent down, snatched it up, clutched it tightly against her chest, and stepped back, her defensive eyes flashing with the wildness of an animal driven into a corner. "It belonged to my mother," she said, her voice tightening, each word rising like a wall between her and everyone in that room. Margaret's hand froze in midair, and it took her a while to find her voice again and ask, very softly, who had woven that scarf. Clara shook her head and said she did not know, that she had never asked and her mother had never told her. She only knew that the scarf had been with her mother since before Clara was born, and that her mother had protected it all her life, as though it were a part of her own body. There had been winters when the two of them no longer had enough money to buy coal for heat, days when they had to sell off every last item in the room in exchange for a meal. But no matter how desperate things became, no matter how much anyone offered, her mother had absolutely refused to sell this scarf. She slept with it in her arms every night, and when illness tormented her near the end of her life, she often gripped one corner of it in her hand, as though it were the only thread tying her to something she never put into words. Clara told these things in a voice that gradually softened, but she still did not release the scarf from her arms, and her eyes remained watchful as she looked at the woman standing silently before her. Margaret could not say another word. She only stood there, one hand pressed to her chest as if trying to hold back the frantic pounding inside it, and in her aged eyes, Thatcher, who had been quietly watching from behind, saw for the first time a light he had never seen in that always steadfast woman, a fragile hope fighting desperately against a deep and ancient fear, and he began to wonder who this strange girl truly was. Standing motionless before the fire with one hand still pressed against her chest, Margaret felt time melting beneath her feet, and the warm room of the present slowly blurred away to make room for another winter night, a winter night that had passed more than 50 years ago, but now rose again in her mind, with every smallest detail painfully clear. That night, the wind had howled through the cracks of the house, which had not yet been properly repaired, and the bone-deep cold of the Highland had crept into the blankets and bedding, making her little daughter toss and turn, unable to sleep. Margaret had been young then, her hair still glossy black, sitting at the wooden table beneath the pale yellow pool of an oil lamp, her hands moving quickly as she passed strand after strand of blue wool back and forth, trying to finish the scarf for her child before winter grew even harsher. Little Rosalind, who had only just turned 5 years old, should have been asleep long before, but she was still curled up on the long bench placed close beside her mother, her large round eyes following every stitch with undisguised fascination, now and then letting out an innocent question about why the snowflakes on the scarf had 6 points, when no one could ever count the points of the snowflakes outside. Margaret had woven while talking with her child, and perhaps because she was too tired after a long day, or because her eyes had grown blurred beneath the weak lamplight, when she reached a snowflake near the middle of the scarf, she miscounted and missed 1 point, leaving behind a 5-pointed snowflake lying out of place among the perfect 6-pointed ones around it. When Margaret realized her mistake, she gave a soft sigh and was about to unravel those stitches so she could weave it properly again. But little Rosalind, who had still been watching intently, quickly reached out her tiny hand to stop her. The little girl giggled, her eyes shining in the lamplight, and told her mother in that sweet, childish voice not to fix it, to leave that flower just as it was, because all the other ones were exactly alike already. And only this one was different, so it would be hers alone. Margaret had laughed at her daughter's whimsical words, and she had done as Rosalind asked, leaving the snowflake with one missing point there as a secret mark that belonged only to mother and child. From that night on, every time the scarf was wrapped around her, Rosalind would eagerly search until she found her special snowflake among dozens of identical ones, then place her small finger on it and smile as though she had discovered a treasure, and that tiny accidental flaw made by her mother had become a sacred thread binding two hearts tightly together, a sweet secret that no one else in the world knew. It was also the very scarf they had wrapped around Rosalind on that fateful morning when her daughter was taken from her arms forever. And for more than 50 long years after that, whenever Margaret remembered her child, the first image that rose in her mind was always that 5-pointed snowflake, the little mistake she had once regretted, then thanked God for, and finally wept over. When the memory released her, and the present room slowly came back into focus before her eyes, Margaret realized that her hands were trembling beyond control, and that her eyes had somehow grown blurred with tears. She looked at the scarf that Clara was still clutching tightly in her arms, then lifted her gaze to the girl's face, a face in which she now began to see familiar lines etched so sharply they made her ache, the curve at the corner of the mouth, the shape of the eyebrows, and that gaze both stubborn and fragile. The truth she had tried to deny all day was now beginning to break open in her mind, piece by piece, and though reason still struggled to hold her back, the mother's heart inside her had begun to whisper something she both longed for and feared to the depths of her soul. Margaret drew in a deep breath to steady herself. Then, in a voice she tried very hard to keep calm, she asked Clara whether her mother had left her anything else besides the scarf, any object at all connected to the place she had told her to find. Clara looked at her for a long while, her eyes still guarded, as though weighing whether she should trust this woman even a little more, and at last she set the scarf down in her lap and slipped her hand into the lining inside her thin coat. From a small pocket that had been carefully sewn shut, something she had clearly hidden well to protect it from the cold and from dishonest hands along the road, she took out 2 things, one after the other. The first was a photograph yellowed by the years, its edges frayed and torn, its surface marked with creases from being unfolded and folded again too many times. In the photograph was a young woman smiling, her face gentle, her brown hair falling loose around her shoulders, but one corner of the picture had been torn away, as though someone had deliberately separated that woman from another person who had once stood beside her. The second object was a silver ring, tarnished and worn thin by time, its face engraved with 2 initials intertwined in an old-fashioned pattern, though the carved lines had faded so much they could hardly be read anymore. When Margaret's eyes fell on that ring, she once again felt her breath catch in her chest, because she recognized it. She had once held that ring in her own hand. She had once placed it herself inside a small wooden box and given it to her daughter on the birthday, when the child turned 5 years old. But she held herself back and did not rush to reach out and snatch it away, because she understood that any hasty movement now could cause the wary girl before her to close her heart completely. Clara looked down at the 2 keepsakes in her hands with a quiet tenderness, then said there was one more thing, the most important thing, but she hesitated and did not yet want to bring it out. Margaret gently asked what it was, and after a moment of silence, Clara reached inside her coat again. This time, she took out an old envelope, the paper yellowed and carefully folded, sealed with a layer of wax that had cracked but remained intact, never once broken open. She said that in the final days of her life, when illness had left her mother so weak she could barely hold a pen, she had still struggled to write this letter, writing it again and again because her hand shook too badly to form the words, and when she had finished, she had sealed it and placed it in her daughter's hand. Her mother had instructed her very carefully that this letter must not be given to anyone, must not be opened by anyone, not even Clara herself, but could be placed only into the hands of one person, the person who would recognize the scarf at first sight, the person who would understand the meaning of the different snowflake among all the others. Her mother had told her that only that person deserved to read these final lines, and that when Clara found them, she would know. Her heart would tell her. Hearing this, Margaret could no longer hold herself back. She took another step toward Clara and softly said that perhaps she was the person Clara's mother had meant, and she asked Clara to let her see the letter. But the moment Margaret reached out, Clara immediately clutched the envelope tightly against her chest and stepped back, her eyes flashing with a fear that did not come from feeling threatened, but from something far deeper. It was the last letter her mother had left behind, the final breath of the woman who had given birth to her, the single fragile thread still tying her to the person she loved most in this world, and she couldn't possibly hand it over to a stranger, simply because of a few coincidental gestures and a tear-filled gaze. She couldn't possibly risk trading away that last sacred thing, only to lose it into the hands of someone she still did not truly understand. Margaret did not press her again. That night, she only nodded quietly, stepped back, and respected the boundary Clara had raised, because she understood that trust was not something that could be seized through impatience. It was something that had to be built little by little, the way one coaxed a flame to life from pieces of damp firewood. And so the days that followed drifted slowly through the house on the highland, a little at a time, in a way that none of them realized was changing them. Clara, exactly as she had said on that first morning, refused to sit still and accept shelter without doing anything in return. She woke before the sky had fully brightened, helped Esther start the stove in the kitchen, wiped the window panes clouded with mist, swept away the snow gathered on the front steps, and did all of it with such quiet diligence that even Walter, the most suspicious person in the house, gradually had to admit that this girl, at least, was not the kind of person who sat around waiting for charity. Little by little, the hard defensive shell Clara always carried around herself began to show tiny cracks. She was still cautious, still had the habit of glancing toward the door whenever someone entered a room, but she had begun to answer Esther's wandering little stories with a fleeting smile, had begun to stay a little longer at the dining table instead of hurrying back to the corner of her own room. Margaret watched all of it with gentle patience, and she chose to draw near to the girl not through probing questions, but through stories. One afternoon, as the two of them sat together trimming vegetables in the warm kitchen, Margaret began to speak of Rosalind, of the little daughter who had once run through the halls of this house, of the bright peal of her laughter whenever she chased the sparrows in the yard, of her strange habit of hiding pretty stones she found inside drawers, and of the way she loved curling up in a warm scarf on winter nights to listen to her mother tell stories. Margaret told it in a soft voice, free of self-pity, and Clara listened with a strange attentiveness, sometimes asking a question, sometimes only smiling in silence, never knowing that the fragments of memory the older woman was sharing were in truth fragments from her own life as well. They began cooking together. Margaret taught her how to make apple pie from the family recipe she had guarded for several decades, showing her how to knead the dough until it felt just right beneath her hands, how to sprinkle cinnamon over the thin apple slices, and in that kitchen, fragrant with butter and caramelized sugar, for the first time since she had arrived at this place, Clara allowed herself to truly laugh aloud, a clear laugh breaking free when dough clung all over her fingers, and Margaret, standing beside her, had to turn away to hide the tears gathering in her eyes, because that laughter ringing through this kitchen sounded so painfully like another laugh she had believed she would never hear again. And then one morning, when Margaret gently pushed open the door of the small room she had prepared for Clara to wake her for breakfast, she stopped still on the threshold. The girl was still sleeping deeply in the soft morning light slipping through the curtains, her face, usually tense with wariness, now relaxed and peaceful like the face of a child, and the old wool scarf, the very scarf that on all the previous nights she had held tight against her chest, as though holding the most precious thing in her life, was now folded neatly on the chair beside the bed, away from her arms. For the first time, Clara had slept without needing to clutch the scarf to soothe herself. For the first time, she had allowed herself to let go, had felt safe enough beneath this roof to sink into sleep without keeping watch. Margaret stood quietly looking at her for a long while, her heart filled with a warm tenderness so deep she could not bear to wake her, and she softly closed the door, smiling to herself in the hallway, completely unaware that these rare, peaceful days were counting down their final hours, and that the greatest storm of all was still silently gathering beyond the horizon. That very morning when Clara slept late became the turning point, because when she woke and came down to the kitchen, catching sight of Margaret quietly preparing breakfast for her with a tenderness that carried no calculation at all, something inside the girl finally softened. She stood at the kitchen threshold for a long while, looking at the older woman with silver hair as she worked carefully by the stove, and Clara realized that throughout the past few days, this woman had not once forced anything upon her, had not once demanded that she repay her kindness, but had simply stayed beside her in a way no one had done for her in a very long time. That evening, after dinner, Clara went to Margaret's room. She stood before her, holding the sealed envelope carefully in both hands, and in a voice that trembled softly, she said she had thought a great deal, and she believed her heart had told her what her mother once said it would. She believed Margaret was the person her mother had been waiting for, the only one worthy of reading these final lines. Then she placed the letter into the old woman's trembling hands. Margaret took the envelope, and her whole body seemed ready to collapse. She sat down on the edge of the bed, put on her reading glasses, and with fingers shaking so badly that it took several tries before she could break the wax seal, she opened the letter. The moment her eyes touched the first stroke of handwriting, she knew it at once. It was her daughter's hand, though altered by the years and made unsteady by illness, yet still unmistakably the same hand, still carrying that little upward lift at the last letters of each line, the very habit Margaret had taught her as a child. She began to read aloud, her voice stumbling over each sentence. In the letter, Rosalind wrote that all her life, she had lived with the bitter belief that her own mother had abandoned her, that people had told her from the time she was very small that her mother no longer wanted her, had rejected her, and had let her go. She had grown up inside that lie, had carried the wound of being cast aside by her own mother for 50 long years, and because of that false belief, she had never dared to return in search of her roots, because how could anyone return to a place they were certain had driven them away? Only in the final years of her life, when she happened to trace old papers and truths that had been hidden for so long, did she understand with horror that everything had been a cruel arrangement, that her mother had never abandoned her, that the person who had spent all those years searching for her in despair was the very mother she had resented. But by the time that truth reached her, the illness had already grown too severe, her time had run out, and she knew she would no longer be able to return herself and kneel before her mother to ask forgiveness for misunderstanding her all those years. So, in those final lines, Rosalind wrote that if she could not make it home herself in time, she begged her daughter to do it for her, to find the house where Snow slept along the fences, to find the woman who would recognize the scarf, and to tell her that her daughter had never stopped loving her, that it had all been only a painful mistake of fate. And then, on the final line, Rosalind signed her name, along with a message for her daughter, asking the girl to call that woman by one word in her mother's place. At this, Margaret's voice failed completely, because just beneath her daughter's signature was the name of the young woman who had carried this letter across so many miles of snow to arrive here. Clara Whitmore, daughter of Rosalind. The letter slipped from Margaret's hands and fell softly to the floor, and that 74-year-old woman sank to her knees, both hands covering her face, her whole body shaking with sobs that had been held back for 50 years and were finally breaking loose. The granddaughter whose existence she had never known, the last bloodline of the daughter she had lost, had been right before her eyes all these days, had slept beneath her roof, had laughed in her kitchen, and Clara, standing frozen in the middle of the room, finally understood why her heart had led her all the way back to this place. That overflowing happiness should have been the beginning of peaceful days, but fate rarely allows those who have endured too much loss to fully savor their joy. Only a few days after the night the letter was opened, while Margaret and Clara were still feeling their way through the unfamiliar new identity of grandmother and granddaughter, another elegant car came up the road to Hollow Pines, but this time it carried no warmth at all. Stepping out of the car was a middle-aged man dressed with polished precision in an expensive suit, his gray-streaked hair neatly combed, and his face already wearing the confidence of someone used to using money to obtain whatever he wanted. Beside him walked a woman of about the same age, glittering with jewelry, her cold, sharp eyes sweeping across the estate as though silently calculating the value of every paving stone in the courtyard. They were Gerald Voss and his wife Patricia, two names Margaret had not heard spoken in many years, two people whose appearance made her face go pale and her hands clench tight. Gerald was a distant relative on the side of Margaret's late husband, a man who for a very long time had been watching the enormous Aldridge fortune with a greed that was never satisfied. They walked into the foyer without bothering to wait for an invitation, sat down with the bearing of people who believed this place would sooner or later belong to them, and Gerald, with a faint smile on his lips, began by saying that he had heard some very troubling rumors. He said he had been told that a young woman of unknown background had appeared on her own and was trying to worm her way into the family, weaving a touching story about a scarf and a lost child to prey upon the tender heart of a lonely old woman, all for the purpose of seizing the estate that should have belonged to the legitimate relatives. Margaret sprang to her feet, her voice trembling with anger, insisting that Clara was her own flesh-and-blood granddaughter, that there was Rosalind's letter, the scarf, and evidence that could not be denied. But Patricia merely let out a soft, mocking laugh, while Gerald calmly drew a thick folder from his leather briefcase and placed it on the table with a look of triumph. He declared that those so-called pieces of evidence had no legal value at all, that anyone could weave an old scarf, anyone could forge a letter, and to prove his point, he held out the papers. He called official records, documents properly stamped and notarized, stating that Margaret's daughter, Rosalind, had died when she was still a small child, that Rosalind's bloodline had ended long ago, and therefore, the woman standing here claiming to be Clara Whitmore was nothing more than a clever impostor who had studied the family's past carefully in order to stage this performance. The most terrible thing, the thing neither Margaret nor Clara could fully know at that moment, was that Gerald's family had been the ones behind the tragedy of more than 50 years earlier. His parents were the hands that had quietly arranged to tear Rosalind from her mother's arms, planting in the child's mind the lie that she had been abandoned, and they had passed this dark family secret down to Gerald and Patricia. Now, the couple was determined to finish what the older generation started, all to clear the way for their ambition to seize the family fortune one day. And now, when the granddaughter they had believed had vanished forever, suddenly returned, threatening to shatter the entire plan they had been nurturing for so many years, they had to strike again, this time with the weapons of forged documents and threats of litigation. Gerald rose, lightly brushed the front of his suit, and said in a voice sweetened with malice that he was giving Margaret one chance to remove that impostor from the house voluntarily before everything was taken to court, where, according to him, the truth would be exposed, and the honor of the entire Aldridge family would be mercilessly stained. The Voss couple left, but what they left behind was more dangerous than their threats. It was a seed of doubt, planted with cruel precision in the most fertile ground they could find, the fear that had been rooted deep in Margaret's heart for 50 years. Before stepping out the door, Patricia had turned back, shaped her face into a false smile of sympathy, and released words that sounded caring but were in truth sharp as knives. She said she understood how lonely Margaret must be, understood how desperately a mother's heart, after losing a child, would want to believe in a miracle, and it was precisely because of that she feared wicked people would use that longing to deceive her. She suggested that a hand-woven scarf was something any skilled craftsperson could copy, even a tiny detail like a flower with one missing petal, if that person had managed to hear the story somewhere. She said a letter written in the shaky hand of a sick woman would be even easier to imitate, and that professional frauds often studied their victims with astonishing care before striking. Then she dropped the final question softly, asking whether Margaret dared to be 100% certain, or whether all of it was only because she wanted so badly to believe that she had convinced herself. Those poisonous words, once they had entered Margaret's ears, began to multiply in her mind like weeds. All that night, she could not sleep. She sat alone in the dark room, Rosalind's letter resting on her lap, and for the first time since that moment of overflowing happiness, she allowed doubt to creep in. She wondered whether her daughter had truly written these lines, or whether they were only the creation of someone cruel enough to dig into her old wound. She remembered the gesture of turning the teacup 3 times, remembered the 5-pointed snowflake, and a cold voice inside her head began whispering that all of those things could be learned, could be staged, if the other person was patient enough and clever enough. The problem was not whether those pieces of evidence were real or not. The problem was that Margaret's heart had been broken too many times, and it no longer had the courage to survive being shattered again. 50 years earlier, she had once believed, once hoped, once waited day after day for a figure to return through the gate. And those 50 years had given her only silence and pain. Now, when a hope greater than anything she had ever known suddenly stood before her, the fear of having it taken away once more became so terrible it nearly stole her breath. She thought that if she allowed herself to believe in Clara completely, only for the truth to someday come out, that all of it had been a fraud, then this time, her old heart couldn't possibly survive. And it was the twisted logic of that fear, that harsh reasoning of self-protection, that slowly began to win inside her mind, drowning out both the voice of intuition and the voice of reason that had once told her with certainty that Clara was her own blood. The next morning, Esther noticed the change in her mistress at once. Margaret had become more distant, more cautious whenever Clara came near, and the way she looked at the girl no longer held the warm tenderness of the days before. In its place was a watchful searching, as though she were trying to find some trace of deception on the face she had held against her heart only yesterday while she wept. Clara felt the change, and her heart twisted with pain, but she did not understand what she had done wrong. She did not know that the people who had just set foot inside this house had quietly poisoned the fragile trust that had only just begun to bloom between grandmother and granddaughter. All she saw was that the woman she had only just begun to dare call her grandmother was slowly withdrawing from her, and that familiar, heartbreaking feeling of being abandoned tightened around her heart once again. That smoldering tension gathered hour by hour until it finally broke open one afternoon, when the sky outside once again began to churn with heavy clouds that warned of another snowstorm moving in. Clara, unable to bear the cold distance her grandmother had suddenly raised between them, went to Margaret and gently asked whether she had done something to upset her. It should have been the moment for two wounded souls to sit together and share what was in their hearts, but the fear that had been poisoned inside Margaret had risen to its peak by then, and instead of listening, she let loose words that she knew, the instant they left her mouth, she would regret for the rest of her life. She asked Clara, her voice trembling yet full of thorns of suspicion, how she could possibly be certain that any of this was real, how she could know Clara wasn't someone created to perform a play, that the scarf, the letter, the little gesture, might all be things memorized and carefully rehearsed to deceive a lonely old woman desperately longing to find the child she had lost. Those words fell into the room like a breath of ice, and Clara stood frozen, her face going pale little by little as every sentence and every syllable sank into her heart. She did not burst into tears, did not scream in protest, did not fall to her knees and beg Margaret to believe her, because she was Rosalind's daughter, and in her veins ran the same proud blood that had once made her lift her head in utter desperation. On the first morning she arrived at this place, she only looked at Margaret in silence for a very long while, and in her eyes there was no hatred, only a deep pain and a sorrowful understanding, as though she had grown far too used to eventually being doubted, rejected, and pushed back out of every door she had ever dared to hope might open for her. She said softly that she had never come here to demand anything, that she had come only to fulfill her mother's final wish, and if her presence brought Margaret nothing but suspicion and suffering, then she would leave so Margaret could have peace. Then she did something that made Margaret's heart ache, even though the old woman was still stubbornly trapped inside her fear. Clara placed the worn silver ring and the old yellowed photograph on the table, pushed them toward Margaret, and said that if these things truly belonged to Margaret's family, then she wished to return them, because she never wanted anyone to think she had come here to take something that was not hers. She kept only the scarf, because it had belonged to her mother, and her mother had held it close all her life. She wrapped the scarf around her shoulders exactly as she had worn it on that first morning at the gate, then turned and walked away without looking back once. She passed through the warm foyer where the fire was still burning, through the halls that had begun to feel familiar, opened the heavy oak door, and stepped outside, letting her slender figure disappear into the white curtain of snow that was growing thicker with every passing moment. The door closed behind her with a deep, dull sound, and that very sound awakened Margaret from the madness of her fear. In the instant the door shut, she looked down at the ring and photograph lying on the table, and she realized something she should have understood long ago, that a fraud would never willingly return the most valuable pieces of evidence and quietly leave empty-handed, that only someone truly innocent and full of dignity would act that way. That truth struck her like a blade, and Margaret's whole body seemed to collapse. She rushed to the door, yanked it open, and called Clara's name into the shrieking wind, but the snow outside had grown so dense it swallowed every figure, and the road leading down the mountain was now nothing but a vast, cold sheet of white. The granddaughter she had only just found again, the last blood of her daughter, had vanished into the storm, and Margaret stood there on the threshold, numb, understanding that she herself, with her own fear, had pushed away the most precious thing life had just returned to her. What neither Margaret nor the Voss couple knew was that from the very first day Thatcher set foot in Hollow Pines and caught Walter's searching glance toward the strange girl, he had quietly set his own machinery in motion. Being a man who never trusted empty words and never allowed the fate of those he loved to fall into someone else's hands, He had silently ordered his people to investigate every corner of Clara Whitmore's life, not out of malice, but because he needed to know the truth before anyone could take advantage of, or wound, the woman who had become a second mother to him. And it was precisely because of that cold caution that when the storm arrived, he already held in his hands things no threat from Gerald Voss could ever deny. His network reached into places ordinary money and power could not touch, and his people had traced old records buried in dusty archives, documents someone had deliberately caused to disappear more than 50 years ago. Piece by piece, a truth hidden for decades began to emerge into the light. He found proof that the papers Gerald had presented, the documents claiming Rosalind's daughter had died as a child, were in fact sophisticated forgeries, made with copied seals and falsified signatures. He followed the trail of money, of secret meetings from years before, and little by little, the role of the Voss couple in the tragedy of the past began to reveal itself. They were the ones who had arranged for Rosalind to be taken away. They were the ones who had nourished the lie that the child had been abandoned by her mother. All of it part of a long, patient scheme to remove the rightful heirs so that one day they could seize the entire Aldridge fortune. But Thatcher was a man who never acted on inference alone. So he did the final and most important thing. During the days when Clara was still staying in the mansion, he had quietly collected samples for testing, and he had a blood relationship test conducted to compare them with Margaret. The night Clara walked out the door and vanished into the curtain of snow was the very night those results were delivered into his hands, and they confirmed beyond question what Margaret's heart had already known before fear stole her reason away. Clara Whitmore carried Margaret's blood within her. She truly was Margaret Aldridge's own granddaughter, with no doubt left at all. Thatcher went to Margaret that very night, in the middle of the storm, and when he stepped in, he found her sitting curled beside the window, her hollow eyes fixed on the white road where her granddaughter's figure had disappeared. He set the folder down before her, exposed every forged document belonging to the Voss family, then finally placed the blood relationship test result on top. In his usual calm, deep voice, though this time touched by a rare sorrow, he told her that everything that girl had said was true, that Clara was her own flesh and blood, and that the people who had planted doubt in her heart were the very same people who had destroyed her family 50 years earlier. Margaret picked up the paper with trembling hands and read each line again and again, and when the truth finally soaked fully into her mind, the old woman could not cry right away because the pain was greater than tears. She sat frozen, her face bloodless, and then from deep inside her chest came a dry, broken sob of agony because she had just realized the most terrible thing of all, that she herself, with her own hands and her own words, had driven the granddaughter she had waited 50 years to find back out into the freezing snowstorm, had repeated the very tragedy of separation she herself had once suffered. Only this time, the one who caused the pain was not an outsider, but Margaret herself. While Margaret was still sinking beneath the torment of regret, outside, on the winding mountain road, buried under snow, a danger greater than the cold itself was waiting for Clara. The Voss couple, who were ruthless in their calculations, had long anticipated that if this girl truly was Margaret's blood granddaughter, then her very existence would become a fatal threat to their entire scheme. And when they heard that Clara had left the mansion alone in the middle of the night storm, they saw in it a chance to erase this troublesome loose end forever. They had sent men to follow her, hired men meant to stop her on the loneliest stretch of road, where no one could hear or witness anything. Clara, exhausted and trembling from the freezing cold, was dragging herself along the road, lost in a blur of white snow, when a car pulled up and blocked her path, and several burly men stepped out, their faces grim and full of threat. She understood at once that she was in danger, and the instinct for survival that had grown familiar after a life of hardship made her hurry backward, her eyes darting around for some way out amid the whiteness on every side. But her numb legs and drained body could not possibly outrun the men closing in on her. At that desperate instant, when the circle was tightening around her, a blinding sweep of headlights cut across the snow, and a black car came rushing toward them at a speed that defied every danger of the slick road, braking hard in the middle of the lane with a long shriek. Thatcher, who had guessed the Voss family's vicious intention the moment he learned Clara had left, had not hesitated for even a second before driving into the storm to find her, and he arrived just in time. He stepped out of the car, his tall figure silhouetted between the twin beams of light, and his appearance alone was enough to make the men stop short, because in the shadowed world where they worked for hire, the name Thatcher Cole was not one anyone dared to take lightly. But this time, because of the money they had already accepted and the order from the Voss family, they still recklessly charged forward. Thatcher did not waste words. He advanced, placing his entire body between Clara and the men threatening her, and the confrontation erupted with speed, precision, and force. He moved with the cold exactness of a man far too familiar with dangerous situations. Every strike meant to subdue rather than show off, and one after another, the men were knocked back and sent sprawling into the snow. During the fierce struggle, one of the men managed to strike at him from behind, and Thatcher, in order to protect Clara as she stood tucked behind him, did not dodge. He took the full blow on his shoulder, a brutal hit that made him stagger. But even wounded, he did not retreat. He remained standing like a fortress wall shielding her, and with his final decisive counterattacks, he frightened the attackers into flight. They scrambled back into their car and sped away, disappearing into the storm-darkened night, leaving the empty road behind with nothing but the howl of the wind. Clara, still shaking with terror, hurried to support Thatcher when he swayed slightly, and she realized that the shoulder of his coat had darkened from the wound. She was flustered, not knowing what to do, but Thatcher only took her hand, shook his head to reassure her, and told her the injury was nothing serious, that the most important thing was that she was still safe. He looked at the girl standing before him, her brown hair covered with snow, her eyes wide with fear and gratitude, and in that moment, the man who had always been cold toward the whole world suddenly felt a strange emotion rising in his chest, an urge to protect this fragile person, something he still could not name. He helped her into the car, carefully wrapped his own coat around her body so she would be less cold, then turned the car back toward the road, leading to Hollow Pines, where a woman was waiting in immeasurable remorse. The car moved slowly through the thick curtain of snow, and inside the warm cabin, a long silence stretched between two people who had just passed through danger together. Clara sat pressed close to the seat, still shaken, her hands gripping the edges of the coat Thatcher had draped around her, and she could not understand why a man so powerful, a man who had looked at her with cold suspicion from the very beginning, would be willing to drive into the storm and take a wound to save someone who shared no blood with him. She quietly asked him that, her voice still trembling from the cold and from emotion, asking why he had done it, why he had risked himself for her. Thatcher was silent for a long while, his eyes fixed on the snowy road ahead, and then he began to speak in a deep, hoarse voice Clara had never heard from him before, telling a story he had never told anyone. He said that many years earlier, when he was still a child, he had once been homeless, an abandoned boy wandering through the cold, with nowhere to return to and not one hand to hold. He told her there had been a freezing winter night when he had curled up beside a stone wall, starving and exhausted, certain that there was no one left in the world who would care whether he lived or died, and then a woman had found him. That woman had not turned away and kept walking like everyone else. She had reached out her hand to him, had taken him home, had given him shelter, a hot meal, and more important than anything, the feeling that for the first time in his life, someone considered him worth saving. That woman was Margaret, and she had raised him, had loved him like her own son, though they did not share a single drop of blood, and it was because of the hand she extended to him on that winter night that he had everything he had today. He said that on the first morning he saw Clara shivering at the gate, clutching the old scarf to her chest with the wary eyes of a wounded animal. He had seen his old self again, had seen the child he had once been, the child who believed the whole world had turned its back on him, and that was also why he had been so guarded with her at first, because he feared someone was taking advantage of the heart of the woman who had saved his life. But now, with the truth made clear, he understood that Clara was not a fraud, but a person carrying within her the same fate of being rejected by life, just as he himself once had. He turned to look at her, and for the first time since they had known each other, there was no coldness left in his eyes. In its place was a warmth so gentle it felt almost strange. He said that Margaret was his family, the only mother he had ever had, and because Clara was Margaret's blood granddaughter, the true bloodline of the woman who had taken him in, from this moment on, Clara was his family too. Then he called her by a word he had never called anyone in all his lonely life. He called her niece, and that simple word echoed through the small car like a sacred acknowledgement that the man who had always stood alone in the world, the man who had grown used to living without allowing himself to belong to anyone, had finally dared to admit that he had a real family. Clara listened to those words as tears rolled down her cheeks, already numb from the cold, because she understood that the man sitting beside her, beneath the powerful and ruthless exterior that made the whole world fear him, was in truth only another soul that had once been deeply wounded, just like her. And she understood that he had risked himself and driven into the snowstorm not because of duty or calculation, but because he had already begun to see her as kin, as blood, as part of the small family both he and she had longed for their entire lives. Just as the car passed the final bend and the familiar iron gate of Hollow Pines came into view, Clara saw a small figure standing motionless in the white sweep of snow near the entrance, and her heart tightened when she realized it was Margaret. That 74-year-old woman had not been able to sit inside the house and wait. She had hurriedly wrapped herself in a cloak and made her way all the way out to the gate, despite the skin-cutting cold, and despite the weary weakness of old age in her legs, to stand there watching the road where her granddaughter had disappeared. When the car stopped and Clara stepped out, the two women stood facing each other in the storm that was slowly beginning to quiet, and for a moment both of them fell silent, unable to speak. Then something Clara never expected happened. Margaret, the mistress of a vast estate, the woman who always carried herself with pride and steadiness, slowly sank down into the cold snow and knelt before her granddaughter. Clara, startled, tried to help her up, but Margaret clutched her hand tightly, lifted her tear-soaked face to look at her, and began to speak words of apology from the very bottom of her heart. She said she had been wrong, unforgivably wrong, that she had allowed her own fear to blind her to the truth her heart had known from the very first moment she saw Clara. She said that for 50 years she had lived inside the pain of losing her child, and that very pain had turned her into a coward, so frightened that she had pushed away with her own hands the most precious thing life had returned to her. She begged Clara for forgiveness, not so that she herself could find peace, but because she couldn't bear the thought that she had repeated the very crime of separation others had once committed against her family. And in that moment, the story did not end with the wealthy grandmother rescuing the poor granddaughter, as people might have imagined. Instead, it was the granddaughter who lifted up the broken soul of her grandmother. Clara knelt with her in the snow, wrapped her arms around the trembling woman, and softly said that she did not blame her, that she understood the fear of a heart that had been shattered too many times, and that from the moment she read her mother's letter, she had known this place was her home. She forgave her, not with empty words, but with her whole heart, and the two people, 2 generations carrying the same wound, held each other tightly in the white snow, letting the tears of sorrow and reunion mingle together. Meanwhile, somewhere else, the fate of the Voss couple had already been decided, but not by fists or bloody revenge. Thatcher, with all the evidence his network had worked so hard to gather, did what he knew best. He used truth itself, and the power at his command, to make those cruel people pay. He delivered the entire file on the forged documents, the plot that had torn a family apart years before, and the illegal acts the Voss couple had carried out for decades, directly into the hands of the proper authorities. At the same time, he used his wide-reaching influence to tighten every shadowy business route the Voss family had continued to rely on. In a short time, the false empire built on Gerald and Patricia's lies and greed began to collapse piece by piece. Partners turned their backs, secrets were dragged into the light, and in the end, the couple who had once believed they could use money and schemes to steal everything were forced to face the consequences of what they had done before the law. They lost everything they had wrongfully seized, their reputation was shattered, and their ambition crumbled, not because anyone had used violence against them, but because the truth, no matter how long it had been buried, finally found a way to rise and demand justice for the innocent. But that reunion in the snow, no matter how moving it was not some magical embrace that could wipe away every wound in a single moment, because true healing had never been the work of one night, but a long journey woven from countless ordinary days placed one after another. In the weeks that followed, Margaret and Clara learned together how to become grandmother and granddaughter, something that sounded simple, but was filled with awkward and heartbreaking moments. There were mornings when Clara walked into the kitchen with her brown hair still tangled, and the sunlight falling at an angle across her face, and Margaret would accidentally call her Rosalind, the name of the daughter she had lost, because in that instant memory and the present seemed to overlap in her aged eyes. Each time, she would freeze, her face briefly touched with confusion and pain, afraid that she had hurt her granddaughter by unintentionally turning her into the shadow of someone else. But Clara never became angry over it. She would only gently place her hand over Margaret's wrinkled one, smile, and softly say that she was Clara, and Margaret would nod, her eyes glistening with tears, answering that she knew that she was sorry, and that she thanked her for reminding her. Gradually, that gentle reminder was no longer a painful correction, but became a private language between the two of them, a way for both of them to acknowledge that the past was still there, still alive inside this house, but that it no longer had to govern their present. Together, they cleaned Rosalind's old room, the room Margaret had kept locked for 50 years, because she had not dared to enter it. But they did not turn it into a cold memorial shrine for someone who was gone. Instead, Margaret asked Clara what color she wanted the walls painted, and Clara chose a soft blue, like the color of the sky after a snowstorm had passed. They wiped the windows clean, drew the curtains open so sunlight could pour in, kept a few of Rosalind's keepsakes on the shelf as cherished pieces of memory rather than a burden pressing down on the present, and transformed the room that had once been filled with tears into a new home for the granddaughter who had returned. Clara, true to the toughness and dignity she had carried since that first day, never agreed to live like a guest or an idle heir. She asked to learn how to manage the estate, followed Walter through the gardens and storage buildings to understand the work, learned the family recipes from Esther, and little by little, the once suspicious estate manager came to place his full trust and even real affection in that hard-working girl. As for Thatcher, after everything that had happened, he became a steady pillar for both grandmother and granddaughter in his own quiet way. He came to Hollow Pines more often than before, not only to visit the mother he loved and respected, but also to watch over his new niece. And though he was still a man of few words and still carried that familiar coldness toward the outside world, with Clara he was always the kind uncle ready to protect her, the one who would appear whenever she needed him, without asking anything in return. Love in that house was no longer measured by dramatic moments or grand vows, but lived in the smallest details of ordinary life. In the hot cup of tea Margaret prepared for Clara every morning, in the laughter rising from the kitchen when the three of them gathered together, in the questions asking whether Clara had dressed warmly enough, in the quiet afternoons when grandmother and granddaughter sat knitting together beside the fireplace. And it was within that simple, repeating rhythm of daily life that the old wounds of all three lonely souls quietly began to close, not by forgetting what had been lost, but by learning how to love what still remained. When winter finally gave way to the warm first days of spring, and the snow on the highland began to melt, revealing the dark brown earth beneath, Margaret, Clara, and Thatcher did something together that all three of them understood, carried a meaning far beyond the act itself. They brought out a small young pine tree, and they planted it right at the place where, on that fateful morning, Clara had once lain curled beside the iron gate, trembling in the cold and in the loneliness of someone who had believed the whole world had abandoned her. Thatcher dug the earth with his own hands. Clara gently lowered the root ball into the ground, and Margaret packed the first handfuls of soil around the base of the tree with her wrinkled hands. Beside that young trunk, they placed a small bronze plaque engraved with Clara's name and a simple line, reminding anyone who saw it that this was the place where a person had been found and a family had been healed. Margaret said the tree was not meant to mark the place where her granddaughter had nearly been left outside the gate, but to remember the place where Clara had stepped into her life, and that, like the pines on these mountain peaks, once it had taken root, it would stand firm through many seasons of storms and live on for generations. Then, on a peaceful evening beside the fireplace, Clara gave Margaret a gift she had been quietly making for many weeks. It was a small piece of knitted wool, woven by Clara's own hands with Esther's patient guidance, and though the stitches were still clumsy and not yet skillful, on it appeared a snowflake Clara had deliberately woven with only 5 points, beside the intertwined initials of grandmother and granddaughter. Margaret took the little piece of wool, her trembling finger tracing each line of yarn, and when she touched that 5-pointed snowflake, her eyes blurred with tears. Clara softly asked whether she should unravel it and weave it again, so the snowflake would have 6 points, as it was supposed to. And Margaret shook her head, smiling through her tears, then answered that she would never want to fix it, because it was that tiny flaw, that old snowflake with one missing point, that had led Clara back to her after 50 long years. Clara thought for a moment, then gently said that perhaps it had never truly been a mistake, and the older woman nodded, because she understood that some things that seemed imperfect were in fact the most precious marks of love, the traces that reminded them human affection was never flawless, yet could still endure through everything. Their story did not close by restoring the years that had been lost, because once time has passed, no one can take it back. but by the choice these three people made to do the best they could with the love that had survived every loss and separation. And perhaps that is also the deepest lesson life leaves us, that a person's dignity has never been found in whether they are rich or poor, but in the self-respect and kindness they hold on to even in their most desperate moments, and that a true family is not created by perfection or by blood alone, but by people who dare to open their hearts to one another, dare to forgive one another, and dare to love one another every day. If Clara and Margaret's story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so we can listen together to many more meaningful stories each day. How did this story make you feel? And what moved you the most? Please leave a comment below so we can hear the feelings from deep within your heart. May everyone listening to this story always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next videos.